Good morning, and welcome to our 2023 seminar featuring Sarah Moore Johnson, Raymond C. Odom, and Professor Phyllis Tate, who will share their presentation, Tax Policy Ideas to Repair Racial Wealth Disparity. I'm Maura Cook-Lemensky, Director of Gift Planning here at the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Along with acting as your host here today, my role includes serving as your back office on charitable giving. Whether supporting someone new to charitable giving, someone considering a gift of a non-liquid asset, someone winding down a private foundation, someone stuck on finalizing their charitable beneficiary designations, someone lost in acronyms around IRA QCD gifts to offset RMDs, or someone unsure of whether they have the capacity to make a charitable impact. The Greater Milwaukee Foundation is committed to meeting folks where they are and being a friendly and culturally competent resource along the way. I am thrilled to be the person on the other end of these phone calls, along with my colleague, Kelly A. Martica, Associate Director of Gift Planning. In our conversations with new donors and their trusted advisors, we discuss both the Foundation's long-standing commitment to honoring donor intent, as well as opportunities to charitably invest alongside the Foundation. A special welcome today to our Herbert J. Miller Society members and members of the Foundation's Community Advisor and Ambassador Network, or CAN, formerly YPA, who we recognize for championing the Foundation with their time, talent, treasure, and ties, and lifting the Foundation to their clients and communities in the past, present, and future. Thank you. Along with offering these annual seminars to express our thanks, we are working to create opportunities to connect through CAN programming and an annual HJM and CAN recognition event. We are hoping to bring back our annual luncheon this year, so please stay tuned. A touch of housekeeping. We have applied for CLE and CFP credits for this seminar. If you have not shared your member information, please reach out. Please also be in touch with your feedback on our seminar today. We are committed to deepening our understanding of how to advance conversations on wealth and resource equity, and thank you for logging on today to join us. We look forward to future opportunities to consider our roles as wealth planners and helping professionals to shift the racial wealth disparities that stretch and perpetuate through history. Now, I would like to introduce Ellen Gilligan, President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation.
Thank you, Mara. Good morning and welcome to the Foundation's annual Professional Advisor Seminar. I'm so excited for us to learn together today. This event will help us explore how financial, legal, and helping professionals can play a role in repairing historic wealth gaps in our community. It's also one way the Foundation can thank you for your partnership as you consider opportunities and solutions for charitably minded clients and friends. As professional advisors and community ambassadors, you are positioned to help others realize that philanthropy is for everyone. The Foundation's North Star of racial equity and inclusion helps us appreciate many forms of philanthropy, including time, talent, treasure, and ties. And as access to participation grows, so does opportunity. A seat at the table, a voice in decision-making, a leadership role in defining, co-creating, and contributing to impact in the community. By the same token, financial and estate planning are for everyone. Doing the work to understand our history and acknowledge the experiences and concerns of communities of color can help grow your practice and network. These are just some of the ways we can reimagine philanthropy together. Because for all the good that philanthropy has done in our world, there are plenty of ways it can be more inclusive and have greater impact. We heard examples of this last fall from our featured speaker, Terrence Franklin, as well as our Professional Advisor of the Year, Blaine Gibson. They encouraged us to push for greater representation and cultural competency in the fields of financial planning, estate planning, and philanthropy. Inviting inclusion in these spaces is a path to wealth equity, and the knowledge and lived experience gained in the process benefits anyone seeking wise financial counsel. The Foundation's community vision of a Milwaukee for all is no small goal. It takes all of us putting one foot in front of the other, one bold step at a time. One of these bold steps is on the table today, exploring the use of estate taxation to help address the racial wealth gap in our nation. I am so grateful to be having this discussion among so many committed partners and innovative thinkers. Thank you for joining the Foundation on this journey. With that, I'll turn the program back over to Mara to introduce today's presenters.
Thank you, Ellen. Without further delay, I'll introduce our speakers. Sarah Moore Johnson, founding partner of Birchstone Moore LLC, is a respected leader in the Washington, D.C. estate planning community who concentrates on estate planning, trust and estate administration, business succession planning, asset protection, and charitable giving, while minimizing income, estate, gift, and generation skipping transfer taxes. Recognized as a fellow of the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, or ACTEC, and as a top attorney in the Washingtonian magazine, Sarah focuses on planning for family offices, entrepreneurs, real estate developers, and art collectors. Raymond C. Odom is a senior vice president at Northern Trust in Chicago. He serves as National Director of Wealth Transfer Services in the Wealth Management Business Unit and is a national subject matter specialist in wealth transfer planning and fiduciary product solutions. Ray works with regional wealth advisory teams and wealth strategists to provide valuable planning ideas to clients, prospects, and their advisors. Along with being recognized as an ACTEC Fellow, he is an acclaimed noted speaker on wealth planning and asset protection topics. And Phyllis Tate, professor of law at Oklahoma City University School of Law, teaches a combination of all our favorite subjects, including federal income tax, wills, trusts and estates, and property-based courses. She also teaches estate and gift tax and seminar courses with an emphasis on income and wealth inequalities and other social justice issues. Professor Tate's scholarship focuses on leading issues in tax policy and social justice. She is well published in law reviews across the nation, and her articles have been cited by leading tax scholars. Professor Tate is a sought-after speaker, panelist, and commentator for numerous national conferences, and along with her recognition as an ACTEC Fellow, she serves on various committees connected to legal education, tax, and probate. And with that, I'll hand things off to Sarah.
To all of the community partners and professional advisors who have made time to be here today, thank you. We're excited to be here. And you all, for your parts, are taking a step in the crucial journey of discovery of how our day-to-day practice as estate planning attorneys, accountants, insurance, and financial advisors fits into the social fabric of America. We're talking about wealth, something we know a great deal about professionally, and race, and how they relate to one another and to us. I'm joined by my co-panelists, Ray Odom and Phyllis Tate.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Ray Odom, and I'm certainly enjoying the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you for being here.
And here's our agenda for today. I'm going to share with you what I've learned about the multiple promises for 40 acres that our government made to former slaves, which laid the foundation for the racial wealth gap. Then we'll turn our focus to an area that we understand, tax policy. Phyllis will explain how tax policy has subsidized white wealth building for decades, which has dramatically widened the racial wealth gap. And Ray will give insight on the racial wealth gap itself and how bad it is. He'll also detail how and why the estate tax is ideally positioned as a funding source for Black reparations. We'll share our ideas for how tax policy and new charitable incentives could help America repay its debt to its Black citizens. And we will end with strategies that you can use in your professional lives to combat the racial wealth gap. I'd like to start with why I'm here today. Like many of you, I serve an extremely affluent client base, and I'm skilled in finding ways to help these clients reduce or avoid income and transfer taxes. 2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd, I became the president of the Washington, D.C. Estate Planning Council. At the time, our membership was 96% white. I started digging into the racial wealth gap, and I quickly learned that our industry and tax policy itself is part of the problem. I was determined to do something about it. But what? Later that summer, I was at a virtual conference of the American College of Trust and Estate Council, which we call ACTEC, and in the middle of a diversity committee meeting, an idea came to me. I put it in the chat. What if we use the estate tax to pay for Black reparations? I could swear I heard some audible gasps from the audience. Well, a friend reached out to me afterwards and told me I had to pursue this and put me in touch with Ray, who then added Phyllis to our team. Ray and I wrote a 100-page law review article outlining our proposal that was published in the ABA Real Property Trust and Estate Law Journal last spring and will be provided as part of our materials. Phyllis has made identifying the racism embedded in the Internal Revenue Code part of her life's work as a professor. I grew up in the South, Tennessee, Texas, and Georgia, to be exact, and my education regarding the War of Northern Aggression, yes, that's what the Civil War was called by most people in the South back then, it focused on the infiltration of Yankee carpetbaggers to the South after the war and not what happened to the former slaves. So when Ray and I started to research this, I was fascinated by everything that I learned about the 40 Acres Promise. And I'd like to share with you today a Cliff's Notes version of that. Much of the history that I will share with you in the coming minutes comes from the book shown here, Repair by Catherine Franke. She's a professor of law at Columbia University, and her work is exceptionally well researched. We recommend it to anyone who's interested in learning more. Our story begins in South Carolina at the beginning of the Civil War. The setting is the beautiful and muggy salt marshes of the Sea Islands, which you may know today as the resorts of Hilton Head and Kiowa Island. In November of 1861, a Union Navy fleet captured the harbor at Port Royal, and as the plantation owners fled the Northern troops, they left behind more than 10,000 Black men, women, and children, who were freed, but not yet free, as the Emancipation Proclamation was still 2 years away. The abolitionists called this period the Port Royal Experiment. There was no real plan for what to do with the formerly enslaved people, called freedmen, and there were competing interests among the government, religious missionaries, and land speculators. The head of the U.S. Treasury, Salmon Chase, and the head of its War Department, Rufus Saxton, were both abolitionists who shared the view that an essential part of the Northern mission was the confiscation and reallocation of land to the freed people so that they could farm that land for their own support. They just needed legal authority to grant that land to the former slaves. That authority came in 1862 when Congress passed a series of confiscation acts that allowed the Union to free slaves and take possession of land owned by Confederates. Under these laws, the government seized thousands of acres of land in the Sea Islands area and agreed to reserve about 60,000 of those acres for the freed people. On that land, the freed people were paid wages by the Union to plant enough food for themselves, as well as tons of high-quality cotton, all without white overseers. The Port Royal experiment was on its way to being a success. Then came the news in the fall of 1863 that the 60,000 acres would be sold at an auction in a few months' time. Alarmed that the freedmen's land would be sold out from under them, General Saxton frantically embarked on a political drama that really should be turned into a movie, because we all know that nothing really happens in America until they make a movie about it, right? So Saxton jumped on his horse and raced to Washington and successfully persuaded Lincoln to make the full 60,000 acres of land available to the freed people at the auction. Lincoln issued an order that gave the freedmen a preemptive preferred right to purchase up to 40 acres of land at a price of $1.25 per acre. This is the first mention in history of the 40-acre reparations proposal. From here, I'm going to detail 7 or 8 other times that the federal government promised land or actually gave land to the freedmen. Within 2 weeks of Lincoln's order, over 1,000 freed people had filed applications for land. Based on various accounts of this time period, the freed people's spirit of entrepreneurship was high, and their excitement was palpable. They pooled their savings to place down payments on plots that they selected. They even began planting crops so that once the land was theirs, not a dollar would be wasted. The document you see here is the preemption claim of 10 formerly enslaved people to collectively purchase what had been the Gabriel Capers plantation in South Carolina. Sympathetic missionaries would draft the document, and the freed people signed their name with an X, as you can faintly see in the middle column. Imagine their disappointment then, when just days before the auction, the tax commissioners reversed course and eliminated the freed people's preemptive right to the land, opening the auction to northern speculators who outbid them one by one, paying in some cases only a few dollars more than the freedmen had bid. General Saxton described the feeling of the freed people as follows. The action of the tax commissioners proved a sad blow to their hopes, and the disappointment and grief of all were in proportion to their previous exultation, in the hope of soon becoming independent proprietors, free men upon their own free soil. Meanwhile, as General Sherman and his troops marched from Atlanta to the sea, many enslaved deserters and newly freed people began caravanning behind them. At the peak, estimates suggest that nearly 17,000 formerly enslaved people were trailing the Union Army, which was a bit of a hindrance to the soldiers. Sherman sought some way to address both their destitution and his need to continue his military mission unencumbered. So he gathered 20 Black leaders to come up with a solution to the refugee problem. Like the freed people of the Sea Islands, Sherman's refugees from mainland Georgia expressed a strong desire for land. When Sherman asked whether the freed people would rather live mixed with whites or on their own, the Black leaders replied that their people preferred to live apart from white people due to the prejudice against them. On January 16, 1865, Sherman issued his famous Special Field Order Number 15, reserving exclusively for Black settlement the entire Sea Islands area, as well as, get this, a 30-mile wide swath of land, which you can see shaded in pink on the slide, stretching all the way from Charleston, South Carolina, down the Georgia coast to St. Johns River in North Florida. On this land, Sherman ordered no white person will be permitted to reside, and the freedmen would be left to their own control. Each family was to be allotted 40 acres of tillable land. The military began to issue thousands of possessory titles in the lands that Sherman had set aside, and the freed people began spring planting on the land as the war drew to a close. To bolster Sherman's order, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency charged with supervising all relief and educational activities relating to the freed people. The Bureau was given custody of confiscated lands in the Confederate States and was authorized by law to divide that confiscated land into 40-acre lots. The lots were to be leased for 3 years, after which time the government could sell the lots to the occupants. At the same time as Sherman's Special Field Order was being implemented on the southern coast, another important area of land was set aside for freed people in Mississippi. General Ulysses S. Grant declared that the lands of Jefferson Davis should be used as a paradise for the freed people. Near what is today Vicksburg, Mississippi, 3 large plantations owned by Jefferson Davis and his brother Joseph, known as Davis Bend, were confiscated by the Union and set aside for the freedmen, who thrived there. They created their own democratic form of government, complete with a court system, general stores, and independent production of cotton for profit. So things were going pretty well. We were taking on the work of repairing and succeeding, which made the assassination of President Lincoln all the more devastating. When Andrew Johnson was installed as president in April 1865, he focused on quickly bringing the Southern states back to the Union and issued an amnesty proclamation that restored property rights to the Confederates. This created much confusion over land ownership in the coastal South. Should the leaders follow the orders of the congressionally created Freedmen's Bureau and give the land to the freedmen? Or should they follow President Johnson's amnesty proclamation and return the land to the Confederates? The Freedmen's Bureau resisted the restoration of property to the Confederates as long as it could. Congress tried to help by passing a new Freedmen's Bill and a Civil Rights Act in December of 1865, which would have statutorily recognized the Sherman land grants and protected the possessory title to that land for 3 years, while Congress sought alternate land to offer the freed people. The Freedmen's Bill reserved 3 million acres of public land across the Deep South for the freed people. But guess what happened? President Johnson vetoed that bill and brought the Freedmen's Bureau under the control of the military, which in turn seized control of the land restoration process. This veto was one of the actions that ultimately led to Johnson's impeachment. The picture on the left of this slide is from the McLeod plantation just outside of Charleston, where about 20 freed people had established a successful farming community, only to have to surrender their hard-won land to their former master as he returned with a military escort. 6 months later, in June of 1866, Congress attempted to resuscitate the 40 acres promise by enacting the Southern Homestead Act. It was designed to give the freed people first choice at an auction of what was left of those 3 million acres of public land in the Deep South. But the Southern Homestead Act was fatally flawed. The land was swampy and too expensive, and the Southern whites refused to publicize the act. Finally, because of Black codes, freed people could be charged as criminals for leaving their employment to attend the auction. Only a few thousand freed people were able to acquire title to land in this way. In early 1867, Congress tried again to pass a bill giving each freed adult male 40 acres, but the bill narrowly failed. Undeterred, Republicans campaigned on the promise of 40 acres and a mule during the 1868 election season. This recitation of history is important because it shows that there was a clear intent on the part of the federal government to allocate land to former slaves. I just shared 7 or 8 instances of the government either promising land or granting title to land and then giving and taking it away. The belief that former slaves would be granted land to live independently was widely held by Northerners as morally just, by freed people as reason for hope, and even by Confederates as fear-based motivation throughout the war. And I don't know about you, but my education led me to believe that the promise of 40 acres and a mule was more of a romantic myth or a pipe dream. The selective memory of our history books did not reveal how close we came to making good on that promise and how hard we actually tried. Imagine the Black wealth that would have been created on those Southern coastal lands if Sherman's order had been allowed to stand, or if Lincoln's assassin had missed his mark. Today, the 40 acres are the vacation homes of the wealthy elite. This lost opportunity to create an inheritance laid the foundation of the racial wealth gap. The case for reparations extends beyond slavery to the near century-long era of legal segregation, violence, and terror, and the atrocities that continue today: mass incarceration, police killings of unarmed African Americans, and sustained credit, housing, and employment discrimination. In the 150 years following the Civil War, our country's racial and economic discrimination against African Americans has only continued to widen the racial wealth gap. But preventing wealth opportunities among people of color is only one side of the story. Equally important, but less discussed, is the government's contemporaneous promotion of white wealth. During the period from World War II through the 1960s, the New Deal and the GI Bill made homeownership possible for a majority of white Americans, but Black Americans were systematically shut out from the same opportunities due to redlining and discrimination. Progressive tax policy was used effectively to tax the rich and grow a mostly white middle class. And just as the civil rights movement started to turn things around, all of our hippie peace and love in the 1970s gave way to a new form of protest, the tax revolt. For those like me who are Gen X or younger, you may not know that there were protests against exorbitant taxes at the end of the 1970s, but it really was a thing. It led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who kicked off the modern era of taxation, which Phyllis will discuss next.
This part of the presentation is dedicated to discussing the impact of tax policy on the racial wealth gap. The Institute of Policy Studies reports that the median white family has 41 times more wealth than the median Black family. Without proper data and context, the leading presumptions place the burden on racial and ethnic minorities to save more and be more responsible with their finances. But that doesn't give an accurate depiction of the systemic problems that contribute to the racial wealth gap. I'll start with home ownership. Home ownership continues to be an important way to build wealth and financial mobility in the United States, but households of color are significantly less likely to own their homes. For Black households in particular, Sarah discussed our long history of redlining and fair housing problems that racially restricted covenants have impacted home ownership. I'm going to talk about how tax policy has exacerbated the problem, starting with the mortgage interest deduction. You can deduct mortgage interest on the first $750,000 of indebtedness. However, higher income limits, $1 million, apply if you deducted your mortgage interest before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was implemented. The mortgage interest deduction has been one of the most expensive tax expenditures. It's only available to people who itemize, and taxpayers who benefit the most need the least amount of financial assistance. This chart is published by the Census Bureau. It provides the annual slopes between 1994 and 2019 of the homeownership rates for white households. They were significantly higher for white households than they were for people of color, and these disparities have persisted over time. In addition to the historical factors that affect homeownership by Black taxpayers, the Census Bureau reports that the monthly housing costs consist more than half of the household income for Black, Hispanic, and Asian households than it does for white households. So when homeownership took a hit during the subprime crisis, Black homeownership dropped to a historical low of 40.6 in 2019, as depicted in this chart. This is another snapshot of income published by the U.S. Census Bureau, which shows that households with income of about $150,000 are overwhelmingly white. Now, why is this significant? The households that are most likely to itemize deductions average $150,000 a year, and according to this chart, at a rate of 84%. Itemized deductions are necessary to be eligible to claim the mortgage interest deduction. And while this is a snapshot, it is consistent with other years. This chart shows the mortgage interest deductions tax expenditures. Tax expenditures are defined by the law as revenue losses attributable to provisions of the tax code. Here we have an investment in home ownership of about $357 billion for this 5-year period. Now, these years are before and after the most recent tax act, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, please don't misunderstand the message. People are free to purchase homes for however much they wish to afford and how much they want to spend. However, don't discount how tax policy is contributing to the unlevel playing field. It's perverse to have a policy that is designed to subsidize high-income households that exclude the same benefit to low-income households. This includes both the mortgage interest deduction and the capital gains exclusion for the principal residence. The principal residence exclusion is also an expensive tax expenditure. The first $250,000 of gain from the sale of a home is excluded from income. The exclusion is increased to $500,000 for a married couple filing jointly, assume they meet the residence look-back requirements and home ownership requirements. Again, taxpayers who benefit the most need the least amount of financial assistance. Which households benefit the most? You probably guessed it. It's the taxpayers who are at $150,000 above and in predominantly white neighborhoods. The property tax deduction on real estate is another expenditure. I already talked about the households that are most likely to itemize, so I won't repeat that. But the state and local tax subsidy is an expensive expenditure, and the taxpayers who benefit the most are the ones who need the least amount of financial assistance. Who benefits the most? Again, it's the households that average $150,000 in household income. You can see a significant increase in the returns in the amount on this chart at about $18,000, which is almost double when you count the last group of over $200,000 against the rest of them. So they account for more than half of the SALT deductions. If we look at the expenditures for the SALT deductions, you can see over the same time period between 2016 and 2020, it's about $180 billion. I just talked about 3 different household subsidies for home ownership. What has been the total investment over that same period between 2016 and 2019? $703 billion. But we're not done yet with subsidies for the wealthy. The next part of this discussion is about capital gains. Capital gains has three different preferences that I want to discuss. They are the rates, deferral, and the complete exclusion in some cases. I just mentioned to you about the principal residence exclusion. So you can exclude up to $250,000 or $500,000. But I'm also going to talk to you about the 1014 stepped up provisions. But before I get to that, I want to talk about rates. Rates are preferences because they have a significant lower tax rate than our ordinary income. And then next, I'll talk about deferral because you need a realization event for that income to be taxed. And for deferral, you can delay how long you pay the tax, or you may not have to pay it at all when I get to the 1014 stepped up basis. For rates, who primarily benefits from preferential rates? If we look at this chart, you have the single taxpayer who makes $41,000 paying the same reduced rate at 15% as someone who makes $441,000. These are last year's numbers, but they get more egregious with every year. Again, if you look at the tax expenditures, you can see that this is a significant tax benefit and at a significant cost. Keeping with the same years between 2016 and 2020, we have about $678 billion represented for tax expenditures for just the preferential rates between 2016 and 2020. Now, if you look at who benefits the most from capital gains property, I'm sure it's no surprise that consistent with the homeownership-based preferences, the income group that benefits the most are the ones who make an average of $150,000. Now, we know that the average or the vast majority of taxpayers earn their income from wages and salaries. So this preferential rates for long-term capital gains and dividends has contributed to increasing income inequality. The stepped-up basis also contribute to the income inequality, because before I leave capital gains, I have to address the stepped-up basis. Here, you have the pre-appreciation on property that's built up over time during life. If you sold that property during life, you would be responsible for the income tax on those gains. However, if you hold that property until death, then after death, and it goes through the estate, the appreciation is wiped out and you have a new basis of the fair market value. In this case, you have not only a deferral, but you also have a complete exclusion because the income tax responsibility is wiped out completely. And consistent with the other provisions I've discussed, I'm going to talk about the exclusions. Over the same time period between 2016 and 2020, you have about $180 billion represented here. So if we look at the provisions for the 1014 and preferential rates, if we look at the expenditure total for these two preferences, it's about $857 billion. The 1014, as well as the preferential rates for housing expenditures, you have about $1.56 trillion in expenditures. This is a significant investment in high-income households for both investing and housing, which are two of the primary pillars of wealth. Finally, before I leave you, I'm going to talk about the transfer taxes. Transfer taxes have a supporting role in creating wealth disparities. Ray, our next presenter, will discuss the historical policy justifications. I'm just giving you the numbers. I've discussed the 1014 information, and in this part, I will demonstrate how reduced rates and increased exclusions under the transfer taxes has reduced tax liability over time for the super wealthy. With the Taxpayer Relief Act of 1997, Clinton instituted the increases that started at $625,000, and those increases were scheduled to reach about $1 million in 2006. So $600,000 from 1987 through 1997. But EGTRA, under the Bush tax cuts, called for more exemption increases. We went from $1.5 million in 2004 up through $3.5 million in 2009. Congress chose not to pass any provision prior to 2010, which led to the looming sunset for the estate tax exclusion for 2010. During that year, significant amounts of wealth passed without an estate tax. Then the American Taxpayer Relief Act under President Obama increased the exemptions again up to $5.12 million. This exemption became an amount that was unified between the transfer tax exemptions for both the estate and the gift tax, and the highest marginal rate went down to 35% for a while before it increased back up to 40%, which result in significant revenue losses for the government, more wealth concentration in the hands of the wealthiest. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which occurred in 2017, which is the focus of most of my presentation, has increased the exemption up to $10 million adjusted for inflation. With the impact of the increased exemptions and reduced rates, there was a significant reduction in estate tax returns between 2010 and 2019. There was a 60% decrease. In more detail, we can look at the returns between EGTRA, the Bush tax cuts, and the Trump tax cuts under Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Here we focus on the taxable returns. The Tax Policy Center reports that there were over 50,000 returns in 2001, taxable returns, and that was reduced down to 1,900 by 2020. And tax liability was $23 billion in 2001 and reduced down to $16 billion by 2020. When we compare revenue sources, we can see that income and payroll taxes carry the heaviest burden to generate revenue. This is where the majority of Americans earn their income, and their burden has increased over time. Meanwhile, the estate tax, which is captured at the top slither at the top of the group, doesn't generate enough revenue to have its own category, and this has been persistent over time. This chart represents the income share between 1950 to 2019, and as you can see, income and payroll have increased over time. Corporate, excise, and the other, which includes the transfer taxes, has decreased over time. This is another illustration of the same point, indicating revenue sources from 2019. Income and payroll taxes carry the highest burden at almost 90%, generating the greatest burden for government revenue. And while we've consistently reduced the tax burden for transfer taxes, the tax code has systematically shifted wealth to the wealthiest white households. There is a clear race and class bias. The information is readily available, and adjustments to tax policies continue to contribute to inequalities. In the words of Marty Ginsburg, tax policy should reflect societal values. To address wealth inequalities, we need radical redistribution of political and economic power. Now we'll turn this over to Ray to guide us through more details on wealth disparities and the methods to help right historical wrongs.
Thank you, Phyllis. Well, we've had Sarah condense 150 years of U.S. history into about 17 minutes, and Phyllis has condensed about 7,000 pages of the Internal Revenue Code into a conclusion that she's just made. What I'd like to do is put a bottom line to this. A bottom line is obviously an economic theory. The bottom line is that cumulative stolen wealth equals the racial wealth gap. I know that word stolen wealth kind of hits you hard, but the point here is that when you sum the 150 years of history and you sum the tax policies that have resulted in discrimination towards African Americans, what you wind up with is the racial wealth gap. But before I get there, I first have to talk about the fact that America has a wealth gap that is not racial. Here we see wealth inequality represented by a chart that shows the entire $110 million of equity that is owned by Americans. And you'll notice the Ben Franklin strip is the strip of American wealth that is owned by the wealthiest 1%. You'll notice also that the slide shows that 1% owns approximately 31% or so of the entire wealth of the country. you'll also notice that that wealth equals about $34 trillion. That's not a big deal, so I suppose, but the more important point is to notice that the next shade down, that dark green, represents the next 10%. And so you can see that the top 1% and the remaining 9% own a lot more than 50% of the wealth. And that's relatively important. But the lowest next shade is the people between that are just under 50%, but above the bottom 50%. And so you can see what they own. But here's the key. That last ribbon of green represents 50% of the American households. One more time, that last little strip represents the wealth owned by the bottom 50% of Americans by wealth. That is wealth inequality. And the next slide shows that the real issue isn't so much for us that there is wealth inequality, but that Black people are the most desperate in America's wealth disparity. That's the key point we want to make to you today. This chart shows the average wealth. Now, it's important to understand the difference between average and median here. Normally, you don't want average because it has the extremes, right? It has the extremes of the wealthiest American who owns whatever billions and billions of dollars they own. And it also has the percentage of Americans in white households that equates to about 10%. 10% of white households have a negative net worth. So the average is going to have both extremes included. But we want that because it's the extremes that really paint the picture that we want to leave for you. That extreme is also painted in regard to Black households. You have certainly Oprah Winfrey at the top, and you have 30% of African-American households with negative net worth factored into this chart. So what does it say? It says that the 2019 average wealth amounts are for white households, $953,000. Yes, and for Hispanic households, brown people, $192,000. For Black households, the number is $141,000. The clear point of this chart is that when it comes to wealth disparity, not only are African Americans often in the bottom half, but they are the bottom of the bottom half with a disparity of over $812,000 per household. Well, you might think that this disparity can be ameliorated by education. After all, that's what we do in America. If you want to get ahead, get an education. But as the next chart shows, that wasn't quite the case in our situation here in America. That next chart shows that when it comes to cumulative wealth disparity, that disparity has not been changed by education. So if you look at the chart where it says high school, it shows the median household wealth by white households to be approximately $115,000. You might also note that for Black households with a high school diploma, it's around $14,000. That's a real disparity, but that's not the biggest point I want to make from this chart. If you go all the way to postgraduate, you'll note that the wealth of white households gets up there around $600,000 as a median. This is median wealth. But if you'll look, the median wealth of Black households, yeah, you're seeing it right, $115,000, the same median wealth that was shown for white households with a high school diploma. This, my friends, is the racial wealth gap. Well, the question you have now is people who are involved with wealth transfer, with charitable giving, you'll want to know, what does estate planning and estate tax have to do with any of this? Well, as the next chart kind of introduces, estate tax can be used as a reparation funding source. As I'm going to show you, reparations, if you try to put some number on it, it gets pretty crazy. But the point we want to make is that estate tax at its rate of 16 billion, that its revenue source of 16 billion, as Phyllis has shown, that estate tax could be a wonderful start to making up this wealth disparity that has roots in the forgotten 40 acres. Well, to start understanding this, we need to start at the beginning. So what I'd like to do now is go back and look at America's initial framing. This slide shows what I've just referred to as the two imperatives that the framers of the United States had in forming our economy, our culture, our country. Essentially, this slide shows that there were two imperatives. The imperative to prevent concentrated, swollen wealth, and the imperative to protect confiscated, stolen wealth. Two imperatives illustrated by one person, Thomas Jefferson. I use him as a proxy for all of America, not to pick on TJ. But the point of it is this, that in America, we readily had a desire to prevent European aristocracies. We did not want to have a monarchy and a class of people who inherited wealth and always had an advantage over others. You'll remember in the feudal system, what you have is land that owns people. And then the people who own the land, often called in feudal systems the nobility is able to then own the people by owning the land because they go to war for the monarch. The issue for America was they did not want a British monarchy. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, said that he felt the British monarch was trying to enslave the American colonialist. So immediately, America decides we will not adopt the British privileged system of European feudalism and British monarchy. Oh, except that I mentioned that, yes, Thomas Jefferson inherited 5,000 acres at the age of 14. And then, oh, did I also mention that he married Martha? And then when she died, he inherited, yes, another 11,000 acres of property, along with about 150 enslaved people, for a total of having about 600 enslaved people over his lifetime. And he also believed, the framers and Thomas Jefferson, that land-owning white males needed to have a personal stake in the government, and that this stake needed to have a bit of equitability, which meant that these small business owners, heard that phrase before? These small business owners, called farmers, would each have an allocable share and right to the American governing system. The only problem with that is, as I've already mentioned, Thomas Jefferson didn't have a small farm. He had a plantation. Finally, the framers believed in the Declaration of Independence's statement that there needs to be the pursuit of happiness. But to do that, you had to have an equal starting line. So the equal starting line to pursue happiness was called equitability. Not everyone equal, but everyone at the equal starting line. Oh, except that Thomas Jefferson, of course, didn't start equal to everyone else. He was a bit more equal. Well, quickly, you say, but Ray, what about this imperative to protect confiscated wealth? Where'd that come from? Well, the point of it was that in America, we believed in life, liberty, oh yeah, the necessity of servitude. You see, American colonies created chattel slavery instead of feudal peasants and aristocrats. So you see, we got rid of the European system, the Russian system, the British monarchy, but we came up with a very unique system that said we will actually put a dollar value in the trading of human beings. And this made America enormously wealthy. So let's look at this idea of concentrated wealth a little more. You see, Bill Gates Sr., yes, William Gates Jr.'s dad, who was an attorney and actually was very familiar with estate planning, in a book called Wealth and Our Commonwealth, talked about why America should tax accumulated fortunes. But to start his discussion of that issue, he goes back to where I started. He says the essence of the American experiment is our collective rejection of European hereditary aristocracy and the grotesque inequalities of wealth that created. He goes on to say that in the Republican worldview, European aristocrats created unbalanced distributions of wealth by controlling the land through inheritance laws, the very area that you and I deal with, and primogeniture and fee entail. And so some of you are wondering, what is he talking about, primogeniture? Well, that is what Prince Harry and the other prince are arguing about right now, right? It's the oldest child inherits everything. The oldest male child inherits everything. That's concentrating wealth. You see, you'll always concentrate wealth if you give the wealth of any individual decedent to one person out of their descendants. It concentrates wealth. And that's exactly how British monarchy and European monarchs got their wealth and to this day keep it. Well, America said, not here. We're not going to do it that way here. We believe, the revolutionaries believe in equitability, as I've already mentioned, a nation of relative equality and fairness rather than rigid equality. So this idea is that preventing hereditary concentrations of wealth was not just kind of a casual thing. It was fundamental to America's founding and framing. And you'll say, okay, I got that, Ray. But as the next slide shows, there was this other little problem. You see, there was stolen wealth. In the book, The Half That Was Never Told, Edward Baptist says that the commodification, suffering, and forced labor of African Americans made the United States, rich and powerful. You're saying, but Ray, how are you going to possibly convince me of this fact in the 35 seconds you have on this particular slide? Well, let me try it this way. If you look at the right hand of the slide, you'll see that there were approximately 4 million enslaved people in 1860. If we use a median value for each individual of $1,000, a value that experts sort of kind of agree on, anywhere between $800 and $1,200. If we use that $1,000 per enslaved person value, it comes out to $4 billion, easy math, in 1860. But if you take that $4 billion and you bring it to present value by inflating it by a percentage, either 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, depending on which number you want to use, you're going to come out with a number that is $20 to $43 trillion. This, my friends, equals the stolen wealth. And you can see when I say that America protected this stolen wealth, you'll see that this becomes the focus of the Forgotten 40 Acres and the efforts by many people to try to make up for this wealth that was taken from the formerly enslaved Africans. Now, you say, but Ray, that doesn't prove that America became rich and powerful. I mean, come on, what's, a couple $1 trillion here and there? Well, just to give you some comparison, the unpaid wage estimate for the enslaved people comes out by some experts to 23 trillion. The comparison is the entire homeowner equity in America reached a record, 35 trillion. And the stock market, depending on the day, is around 40 trillion. So can you imagine what America would be if you suddenly pulled out all home ownership equity? If you suddenly pulled out the stock market? This, my friends, is the thesis that said the wealth that was stolen from African Americans, formerly enslaved people, literally made America rich and powerful. Well, you say, now, what are we going to do about that? We've got swollen wealth and stolen wealth. Well, one of the things you should know is the estate tax is uniquely positioned to deal with wealth disparity. The design is that wealth disparity represents swollen wealth. And you're thinking, well, Bill Gates said that, but that was recently in the year 2000. Was it ever something that became a part of the legislative history of a state tax? The answer is yes. And we start by looking at President Theodore Roosevelt. Now think about the time he was in office. We're coming off of the post-Civil War, has been over the, so to speak, reconstruction has been deconstructed. So now all the wealth that came from those billions of dollars that was taken from formerly enslaved persons is now working its way out in the economy, and it's working its way to a small group of industrialists who become what we termed robber barons during the Gilded Era. But this Gilded Era causes a widespread progressive movement that begins to question the value of having concentrated wealth. The answer? We should not have concentrated wealth. And Theodore Roosevelt picks up on that and says the following: the really big fortune, the swollen fortune, there's the word, he said it, not me, by the mere fact of its size acquires qualities which differentiate it in kind as well as in degree from what is possessed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, I believe in a graduated inheritance tax on big fortunes. Now, those of you who are tax experts know that we do not have a national inheritance tax. It is a tax on transfer. But I love the cartoon to the right, because what it shows is it shows Roosevelt back from vacation, and he's looking at this person with swollen wealth, and he's saying, we need to get you into the operating room. And that operating room is going to be known as estate tax. We're going to cut some of that out and redistribute it. And you see, this is the key that makes estate tax the logical and compelling start of a place to fund reparations. Well, as the next slide shows, this whole idea of estate tax being relevant to wealth disparity isn't just something I'm making up. Let's look at the history that has already been referred to by Phyllis as she talked about the rates and the differences between the various administrations throughout American political history. You'll notice that from 1890 to 1960, wealth concentrated. The chart at the top has the top 1/10 of 1%. Remember, not the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%. That top 1/10 of 1% at the height owned about 25% of all American wealth. Wow, stop, take a breath. Well, that then drops when the estate tax and income tax are introduced around 1916, 1917. It drops precipitously. Oh, but then they figure out that because the gift tax had been repealed, hey, we can still concentrate wealth, just avoid the estate tax by giving it away during life. Well, about 1930s or so, they figured out and put the estate and gift tax together, and look what happens. You'll see in that top chart, wealth of the top 1/10 of 1% goes from 25%. It starts to trickle all the way down to gets down to like 6% of the total wealth. And during that time, if you look at the chart on the bottom, you'll see, as Phyllis has already alluded to, that estate tax rates have gone way up. The estate tax rate is above 70%. That's right. If you die with $1 billion, you're giving up, $770 million to the government for redistribution. And look at how long that lasts. From basically 1916 through till 1984, you have very high estate tax brackets. It is surgery on swollen wealth. And look at the exemption amount. It's the other line, it's at the bottom, very small exemption amounts. Now look at what happens during the time that both Phyllis and Sarah have referred to. When we get into the tax cut, taxes are bad era, all of a sudden the rates come down and the exemptions go way up. The lines switch. But look at what happens in the top of the chart to wealth disparity. Yep, it climbs right on back up where the bottom, the top 1/10 of 1% are up again around 20% of all the wealth in America. You say, Ray, I think I get the point. What should be done to bring these two things together? Well, the next slide kind of gets at that. You see, what we think has to happen is you have to have a complete study that takes into account all the things that Sarah has said, all the history, all the discrimination, all the things that have created mass incarceration and that led to the most recent civil unrest caused by the murder of George Floyd. Well, H.R. 40 was introduced in 1989. And I should say that that was about the year after America signed and incorporated a bill to pay reparations to formerly interred Japanese Americans on the West Coast. That payment of reparations to that small group of injured Americans began to be the impetus for John Conyers, Congressman John Conyers from Michigan, to begin an effort to get reparations for the formerly enslaved African Americans and all Black people. And what he did is introduce a bill that he labeled in honor of the forgotten 40 acres, H.R. 40. And that H.R. 40 bill was in Congress for the last 30 years. Finally, it was voted out of committee in 2021. And there was the possibility it would get a floor vote. Well, it didn't. But let's look briefly at what this bill would have done. First of all, it would have had a truth and reconciliation model. By the way, if you're wondering what that looks like, yeah, this would be truth and reconciliation model that we're doing today. It was a 13-person commission. It was going to educate the public about all the things, as Sarah mentioned, that people didn't get when they went to public school. It was going to try to change the discriminatory laws that Sarah also mentioned have continued to make the inequities of enslavement continue to have a great impact on African Americans. And then it was going to issue a formal apology, which is taking accountability at the government level for this. And then finally, it was going to provide for reparation. Notice that compensation is just the final part of a much bigger picture. And you say, but Ray, that failed, that's gone. Why are we wasting time? The Congress has changed. That's never going to go anywhere, is it? Oh, no. But there's this California task force that did have a law that passed the state of California, signed into law by the governor, and implemented by a task force that is currently meeting. That task force has produced a 600-page conclusion that says, yeah, you think it's bad? It is bad. And the disparity that Ray has already referred to, it is a real disparity. And in LA, there are parts that it's even worse, depending on the location, the city, the county. And so they have begun to literally design remedies. One of those remedies is to create a commission that will actually administer reparation remedies. This commission is exactly the kind of thing that could be funded by the amount of money raised by the estate tax revenue. The Commerce Department basically runs on about $16 billion. Now, we think that the estate tax could literally begin funding a department that could begin to straighten out this wicked problem, in the sense of complicated, wicked problem of the racial disparity caused by the forgotten 40. Sarah?
Using the estate tax to fund reparations ties the source of the funds to the wrong. Extractive economics has promoted white wealth and eroded Black wealth. So as Ray has suggested, we take the swollen to pay for the stolen. Evanston, Illinois gives us a great model of using a source of funds that directly ties to the wrong being repaired. When Evanston City Council passed reparations legislation in 2021, lawmakers carefully documented and then confessed to the city's historic policies of Black exclusion, redlining, and Jim Crow segregation. The council then showed that the over-policing of Black people in Evanston was often justified under the cover of illegal drug enforcement. So they created a tax on newly legalized cannabis as a dedicated source of funds to pay the city's victims of racial injustice. Given that Evanston's history of residential segregation was the harm that most clearly resulted in economic deprivation in its Black community, the City Council decided that eligible recipients of reparations payments would be those who had resided in Evanston from 1916 to 1969 or their descendants. The revenue from the cannabis tax will provide benefits in the areas of home ownership, home improvement, and mortgage assistance. In addition to Evanston, there are 20 cities currently contemplating reparations, from Nashville to Boston to Minneapolis to Denver. A tax on cannabis is not going to work in every jurisdiction, at least not yet. But here in the District of Columbia, where I sit, and in 12 other states, including Wisconsin, we do have a state level estate tax, which could be earmarked for reparations at the state level for the reasons Ray outlined at the federal level. Not only are reparations moving forward at the state and local level, corporations like JP Morgan Chase and Lloyd's of London and other private institutions are getting into the mix. Charitable organizations have also been important leaders in reparations efforts. For example, Georgetown University has been in the news for its efforts to redress a sale that its founders made back in 1838 of 272 enslaved people in order to save the school from bankruptcy. Alumni have traced the ancestry of the sold slaves, whose names were all clearly delineated in the school's records. Today, the identities of victims' living descendants have been genetically established, and the Jesuits and the university have pledged to raise $1 billion for a newly created Descendants Trust and Reconciliation Foundation. The picture of the large group of people you see here are the descendants of the sold slaves at a reunion meeting on the Georgetown campus. Many churches are also atoning for their role in the slave trade. The Episcopal Church has been the most active thus far, with the dioceses of Texas, New York, and Maryland setting aside a combined $15 million for long-term programs benefiting African Americans. But unlike the program in Evanston, the funds that these charities have set aside will not generally be spent on direct payments to descendants of slavery, because private inurement is forbidden under Code Section 501c3. Charities are limited in their reparations efforts to scholarships or community investment. To allow the federal government to leverage the progress and existing infrastructure of charitable organizations, we came up with two ideas for charitable incentives that would allow private citizens and charities to redistribute wealth. As we discuss these ideas, it's important to note that we as a panel are not taking a position on how reparations should be structured. There's great debate about who should be eligible for reparations, whether repair should take the form of direct payments to Black Americans, or whether the focus should be on investments in Black communities. That is for the HR 40 Commission to decide, just as the California Commission is doing right now. General Sherman got something right with his Special Field Order number 15. He listened to Black leaders and gave them exactly what they requested. But one thing that our panel does strongly endorse is that truth and reconciliation component that Ray mentioned. We think there must be a formal apology and therapy in the form of truth-telling before we can seek forgiveness. So, back to our two-pronged ideas. We have a solution for the community building aspect of reparations and another for direct payments. On the community building side, we had the idea for a new type of charity, what we call a 501c40 reparations organization. So Code Section 501c currently ends at subsection 29. We propose to reserve an additional 10 subsections of the code, just set them aside for a future use, and create Section 501c40 to commemorate the Lost 40 Acres Promise and HR 40. We suggest that reparations organizations be led by Black Americans and have as their purpose carrying out the recommendations of the HR 40 Commission, whether it be through economic assistance, housing benefits, educational opportunities, healthcare initiatives, or criminal justice reforms. These organizations could be permitted to make expenditures for communities at large, or they might be permitted to make direct payments to eligible individuals. Thousands of these organizations already exist as 501c3s, and they would automatically qualify as 501c40s. And we expect that new organizations serving Black communities would be established as well. In designing 501c40, we wanted the application process to be very simple, more of a notice of existence than a request for permission. This is particularly true after the revelation that the IRS has discriminated against political groups in the past, such as Tea Party type applicants in 2015. If white conservative groups can be discriminated against, it can surely happen to organizations supporting Black prosperity. Ray posited that the 501c4 application process for social welfare organizations would be ideal, as it requires only a simple electronically submitted Form 8976 to begin operations. To maximize charitable contributions to reparations organizations, we would propose eliminating the AGI limitation so that a person could reduce their annual income tax liability to zero by contributing to 501c40s. On the gift and estate tax side, we would propose a credit rather than a deduction so that for every dollar paid to a 501c40, a person would have an extra tax-free dollar to give to their heirs. These advantageous charitable incentives would be reflective of the fact that the contributor is not just being benevolent, they're actually helping the federal government pay a debt that it owes to Black Americans. On the direct payment side, we had the idea that direct payments made to eligible recipients, paid either by the government or by reparations organizations, could be deposited in something called a 501c40 account for the benefit of the eligible recipient, using a structure similar to what we already have in place for 529 plans. Recipients of a 501c40 account could invest the funds on platforms managed by the states in collaboration with investment firms, just as we currently do with 529 plans. Also, as with 529 plans, the funds could grow income tax-free, and tax-free distributions could be made for qualifying expenses that meet the directives of the HR 40 Commission, such as debt repayment, home purchases, education, and healthcare. Given that we anticipate direct payments to individuals could be made from multiple sources, both from the government and, if we have our way, from 501c40 reparations organizations, then to promote equity and fairness, we would recommend an aggregate contribution limit per recipient, just like we currently have with 529 plans. I sound like a broken record, but here the limit would be tied to the target amount of direct payments recommended by the HR 40 Commission. So say the government determined that its debt to eligible recipients was $160,000 per person. Ray talked about the average disparity between Black wealth and white wealth, but the median disparity between Black and white wealth is what's often referenced in the press, and that's $160,000 per household. That's the difference between the average or the median white wealth and the median Black wealth. So say that's the amount that Congress determines is available for eligible recipients of reparations. If a reparations organization contributed $160,000 to the 501c40 account for an eligible recipient, then that recipient would be ineligible to receive further benefits from the government or other reparations organizations, thus freeing up more public and private funds for other eligible recipients. And finally, we anticipate that these 501c40 accounts would be transferable at death by beneficiary designation to other eligible recipients, thus allowing more Black Americans to enjoy the financial security that an inheritance brings. So those are our ideas. With the help of our fellows in the American College of Trust and Estate Council, we're actually drafting legislation to incorporate these ideas into Section 501c of the code, and we hope to present the proposed legislation to Congress within the year. One advocate for Black reparations, Nakichi Taifa, has said, our reparation settlement should be creative. The harm was multifaceted, and the relief should be as well. So we think we've come up with a few creative and multifaceted solutions. And that is what we are doing for our part in helping this problem. But for professional advisors and the community in general, what can you do? What can we all do to affect change? Well, we are at our best when we help our clients save taxes, earn a higher rate of return, and plan for liquidity when needed, all in a manner that promotes family harmony rather than creating strife. But when we do this work for mostly white clients, we're worsening the economic divide in our country. And inheritance, or the lack thereof, is another key driver of the racial wealth gap. White Americans are 3 times more likely to receive an inheritance than Black Americans. And inheritance just happens to be our specialty. But if Black and Brown Americans are underrepresented in our profession, those communities are far less likely to seek out advice and assistance from their peers. And they are underrepresented. Here are some statistics. Black and Latino groups make up more than 30% of the country's population. Yet less than 3.5% of all of the 80,000 certified financial planners in the United States are Black or Latino. The American College of Trust and Estate Council. It's an organization for the best and brightest estate planning attorneys in the world. It has 2,500 fellows, and only 6 of them, maybe 7 now, are Black. In fact, you have 1/3 of ACTEC's Black fellows here with us today. So I encourage each of you to consider your hiring practices and how you can create opportunities for people of color. You could join or organize pipeline programs that seek out to place students of color in internships and jobs in the estate planning profession. Your firm's name and reputation could be a stepping stone for a young professional in our industry. And once you've hired a person of color, mentor them and sponsor them. Don't assume that just because they've gotten their foot in the door, it is now a level playing field, because it is not. Give your Black and Brown employees extra training and champion them in any way that you can. And I would also urge you to look at your client base. How many clients of color do you have? If less than 30% of your clients are people of color, then you probably have work to do. I know I do. So how do we seek out clients of color? First, I would suggest that if you're approached by a potential client who's Black or Latino, accept them, even if they don't meet your minimum or your typical client profile. Do a good job for that person and ask for referrals to the high net worth people in their social and professional circles. My first Black client was a businessman who was introduced to me by someone at my former firm. That client then introduced me to the pastor of his church, who had a $30 million life insurance policy and no estate planning. The pastor then introduced me to doctors and other professionals in the congregation, and I hope I built a reputation as someone that the community could trust. So talk to Black and Brown people in your network and let them know that you'd like to increase your client base in their communities. And if you don't have any people of color in your network, which might be the case, then start following diversity and racial equity hashtags on LinkedIn. And before long, your social media feed will be filled with professionals you can network with. Once you have a client of color, this is my last piece of advice, give them a complete checkup. Don't assume anything. One of the most important things that you can do is check the interest rate on their home mortgage. Predatory lending practices are still a problem, even for wealthy people of color. I find often that their interest rate is twice what it should be. So we introduce them to a trustworthy lender, as well as a financial advisor, an estate planner, and an insurance advisor if they don't already have one. Ray and Phyllis, I know you have some ideas too, and you might want to make some comments on some of mine.
Well, I think Sarah, your ideas are really good, and I think we'd be all well served to follow them. I would add this. I think the problem with this problem, the problem of racial inequality, is, as I've said in my presentation, a wicked problem. And that's a term of art. It's a term of art that indicates a social problem that's so complex that even solutions that are well-intended could actually make the problem worse. And we've seen that, right? We've seen that with the idea of integration. All it did was destroy Black neighborhoods and Black culture, but actually we're more segregated today than we were in the 60s. We've also seen that as people deal with the whole notion of affirmative action, which has become a new buzzword that can clear a room faster than, bad ventilation. The reality is that some of our best and brightest ideas are co-opted, because I think that we forget that this thing of racial wealth inequality and racism is kind of like a virus. It just mutates with time. So my focus would be to say this, that we all have to believe that this problem is personal to our situation. And to do that, I would just introduce one kind of urgency that may give people more of a personalized approach to it. I believe that wealth disparity is a major problem for America. I believe it's the problem that causes people to want to overturn governments on a certain day of the the year after election. I believe it's the thing that causes cities to get burned to the ground. But the spark that has consistently been the spark that lights that kindling in America has been the embedded racism that has been endemic to our country. And so I would say to people, this problem of wealth disparity, don't think of it as some political issue on a platform. Think of it as a problem that's come to a theater near you. Mm-hmm. And that if we don't find a way to work this problem out, think back to what you felt on the worst day after the George Floyd murder protests began. Think about what you think. Well, I'm old enough to have had that day about 5 times in my life. And I know that that day is going to come back unless we are creative, diligent, and make it personal. And so, Sarah, I guess my thing is just make it very personal. Be personally the solution. And all the things you said, I think, are part of that. But I think we have to really, really make it personal. Otherwise, any solution just becomes one of those kind of things you say to people, is that enough yet? Is that okay? No, that's not it. We actually have to want to change because it affects us. We have to believe each white person, brown person, and say, if this isn't fixed, this affects us. I love the initials, Sarah, for United States. Yeah, it's just us.
And to add to that, I thought of some ways in which we can facilitate wealth building tools for the lower income and Black communities. One of the things I've done as a scholar, professor, is to make sure I try to build that pipeline of attorneys and politicians who are going to be the next generation leaders who help facilitate this goal. And so I have introduced students to tax LLM programs and to estate planning for many years. And I've been very, very intentional about it. Not just Black students, there were a significant number of Black students, but also students of other race, colors, and ethnicities who are sympathetic to the cause and who can help facilitate and be good allies for the cause. One of the great places and sources where we can do that are historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. These schools have students who plan to a career in estate planning and other related fields, and they are a wealth of resources that we can use to help further this cause. So helping provide scholarships will help negate the debt that is associated with getting that education. As you recall, Ray talked about earlier, you have postdoctorate students who have the equivalent wealth of a high school white person. Part of that, a big part of that, is the debt that is associated with getting that education. We know that many white households have family members and friends who can help get them scholarship, help get them in the right room with people who can facilitate paying for their education so that they leave low debt or no debt, while many Black students who pursue that same education leave with substantial debt, which negates that wealth. So contributing to HBCUs, whether it be undergrad to establish that pipeline, or whether it be for law schools to help facilitate debt reduction through scholarships, that will go a long way in facilitating both diversity in our field and reduce the racial wealth gap for those particular families. That's one way. Another way is to help facilitate home ownership for the people who already own homes. While they may not be the type of homes that benefit from the principal residence exclusion or the mortgage interest deduction, having a home is a significant part of the wealth building, wealth mobility tools. One of the greatest sources of land loss for Black families is heirs property, where this property goes from generation to generation, becomes more and more fractionalized, becoming less and less valuable and harder to alienate. There are some very simple ways which we can do that don't require any legislation. We can work with legal aid organizations or work with those families to help quiet title for them. And that's going to help build those wealth building tools for those families. As Ray talked about earlier, through the aristocracy, they concentrate their wealth through one person within the family. The opposite problem is created by the probate tools and the wealth transfer tools that we have at the lower income level through heirs property, because the natural and the legal effect of tenancy in common works to negate wealth and wealth erosion for those families. So those are two very easy, simple ways in which we can work with the things that Sarah talked about and that Ray talked about to help facilitate wealth mobility tools for these families that don't require any type of legislation, just commitment on our part to do our part.
And I would add, thank you, Phyllis, as a closing thank you to our organization today. I would suggest that you also talk to your charitably inclined clients about how they can help close the wealth gap through philanthropy. And you can connect them with the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, as its work is guided by a North Star of racial equity and inclusion. Thank you all for your time today. We've enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you, Sarah, Ray, and Professor Tate. And thanks to our audience for your attendance and for your support over the years, today and tomorrow. On behalf of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, the Herbert J. Miller Society, and the Community Advisor and Ambassador Network, thank you for considering what you can do to advance racial equity and inclusion in your role as a leader and as a professional. Please be in touch with your feedback from today's seminar and as the Greater Milwaukee Foundation can support your clients and networks in their philanthropy. Enjoy the rest of your day.